Hello and welcome to the session where we will be looking at administering Windows Server hybrid core infrastructure, also following up on the new Windows Server hybrid core infrastructure course, the AZ-800. My name is Adnan Hendricks. I'm a cloud solutions architect, advisor. You can follow me on my social media channels at MicroSpecialist. And I'll be also hosting the AZ-800 session on the 21st of June, the Configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. The session objective for this session is really just to show you some of the ways you can administer core Windows Server workloads, both on premises and also in a Windows Server hybrid environment. Because the future is hybrid. It's the most common operating model that companies are moving towards when their services workloads, while still needing to run things on premises. And there's certain reasons or services that are maybe better to run in the cloud. So today it's all about the control plane that's stretching across these environments. So within the session, I'll be showing you how you can both manage your on-premises environments and also your Windows servers in your Azure cloud using both Azure services, etc., or also to deploy consistently across your different environments. For the agenda, we'll start off with a little Server 2022 introduction, because we will be looking at some of the new features that are made available with Server 2022, and then following up with managing identities, both on-premises identities and also cloud identities, looking at Windows servers and workloads, managing specific Windows on-premises servers and workloads, and also using cloud workloads, and then looking at things like virtual machines, both Hyper-V, virtual machines on-premises or clustering, and also containers. After that, it's on-premises and hybrid network infrastructure. So you will be joining your on-premises network with your virtual networks in the cloud. And these networks need to be combined in a specific way. And in Azure, you have different methods and ways in which to be able to create those network connections, both through VPN gateways and also through things like express routes, and also just connecting different services that you might be running in the cloud. Lastly, we'll be looking at setting up storage and file services, how you can host file servers with Windows Server 2022, and also migrate or move specific data to have it hosted in Azure. Looking at this feature comparison, you have different editions of Windows Server. So you have Windows Server 22 Standard and 22 Data Center, which is the more common variant. They basically have the same features and functionality set. The only difference is really as listed by the blue arrows, where it differs with a special Server 2022 Data Center edition that you only get on Azure, and that's the Azure edition, which brings the new features like hot patching that doesn't require a reboot. So you can see that that's only available with the Azure edition. And then the SMB over quick and software defined networking, which is both features and functionality that's only available on Azure. There's still a Essentials edition for up to 50 users, but that will be skipped in this session. And so you can see quite a lot of features and functionality that's both available on all the different versions. For example, Standard and Data Center is pretty much on par. is just when it comes to hybrid or virtualization benefits, and also the amount of cores that's made available. Installing the server edition or server 22 editions, they available through ISO, or you could download the evaluation disk, which you can load later also enable to a licensed version. So some of the installation options when doing the installations is still the clean install, in-place upgrade, which is a lot better. You also have the way to migrate depending on the type of workloads. So in some cases, you won't be doing an in-place install. You'll do a clean install and then either migrate the workload or migrate the services or application that's running on that. Creating new domain controllers with server 22. That's one of the scenarios where quite often you'll do a clean install, promote the server to a domain controller, and then you won't go and do an in-place upgrade, for example. So that's one of the scenarios where you do more of a clean install and migrate the workloads. With the cluster editions and also the Azure editions, you have cluster OS rolling upgrades that you can also create within your Hyper-V or virtualized clusters. There's still the install from USB option, and the you might have been used to having a semi-annual channel version with Windows Server 2019, 2016, etc. With Windows Server 2022, we moving back to only one release each year, and that will be the LTSC long-term service channel. So no more semi-annual channels available. And like I mentioned before, you can try with the evaluation version, and you can always convert that to a retail version. So for those of you that haven't seen it before, my next or first demo will just be walking through some of the screenshots of doing a clean install, and it's pretty much the same like the previous server 2019. So when you install or set up the ISO or install a USB, you'll see that the first screen will pop up stating the language to install, the time and currency format, and also then usually your keyboard. Once you set that, you can click on install now. First thing you have to fill in would be your key, your activation key or your product key, your license key. And depending on how you license, if you're doing KMS, you can fill in a KMS client key, and this will be able to be activated in that way as well. So just fill in your product key. With the next session, you'll see that you will be able to choose the operating system. So you could install the core version or the desktop experience version. So in my case, I downloaded the data center ISO. And in case you download the standard, you'd have the standard option. So for the next step, you just have to apply and agree and accept the EULA and the license terms. This is where if you're doing to do a upgrade or in-place upgrade, or maybe a custom install where you can select in-place upgrade or installing it custom, maybe selecting the disk or just creating a new disk in the process. And once you've done that, it will just go to the next step where it's just copying the files. And once the step is done, it will give you the getting ready, and the first highlight would be to enter in a administrator name and the password for the local administrator account. So once that's been entered, it will finish up the installation by applying the different computer settings. And then once that is done, you'll be greeted with a nice login screen and just having to enter in the password. So you can see it's pretty easy and normal, decent to set up. I know that a lot of people quite often create images, or if you're deploying Windows Server or Windows Server from the Azure portal, you can already select images, and then it's already just placing in the installation for you. So you just have to add in your account and sign in once that's done. First step I'd like to talk about is management. With Windows Server 2022, we have different ways in which to manage the operating system or the install. So once you've installed Windows Server, the first thing that normally opens up is the Server Manager. The Server Manager is really where you can go and install features and roles onto that server, because it will be a member server. You might have to add it into the domain and do all the other finalizing of the configuration. So with Windows Admin Center is generally the new way in which you would manage the servers in your environment. It's a HTML web-based tool. You can download it from the Microsoft Windows Admin Center download site and just run it on any machine. So besides Server Manager adding the roles, we have Windows Admin Center. There's PowerShell for people that are more familiar with utilizing PowerShell and configuring and managing the servers, installing different features, maybe doing some sort of dynamic configuration with PowerShell. For people that are already utilizing Azure Arc, you can also manage Windows servers with Azure Arc available in Microsoft Azure. There's generally the two distinct builds or versions that you can install on a server, which is the server core and also the desktop experience version. The desktop experience version is generally people that require the graphical user interface, or they will be utilizing some sort of application that requires the graphical user interface. But if your application or your workloads doesn't require a GUI or graphical interface, you can just use the minimal command line, for example, PowerShell or the sconfig or CMD. So all the command line tools. With Windows Server Core, you get a smaller footprint. You can install roles through PowerShell, and most of the features are available. Some of the roles services might not be available for Windows Core. But some of the nice features is that you can get the app compatibility feature on demand, which can do a minor update for some of the applications that don't do well with the server core feature. There's also the remote management features and options that's available. So all Windows servers are available to be managed remotely through things like RSAT, Windows Admin Center, and also Server Manager, PowerShell, etc. But the main reason Server Core does well, the smaller footprint and the smaller attack surface. So quite often I get asked, why move to the latest version of Windows Server? And I always say it's all about the security. So Windows Server 2022, and that's something that Microsoft works and invests heavily in, is always improving their security posture of all the products that they make available and operating systems, looking at even Windows 11. So a lot of the improvements from operating security point of perspective. Windows Server has advanced multi-layered security by utilizing different security controls. And it's also a very flexible application platform, also supporting applications with high specs, large memory requirements, and it comes with or makes use of a secured core server. It has firmware protection, things that we are already familiar with, like UEFI boot. Makes use of virtualization based security, and also all hardware OEM has hardware root of trusts. So all the hardware and things are certified for Server 2022. Secure connectivity comes in the form of HTTPS and also TLS 1.3, which is enabled by default. Secure DNS or encrypted DNS, where resolution requests with DNS over HTTPS. SMB direct with RDMA encryption, and then obviously Azure auto-managed hot patching, which you get with the Azure edition for those of you that are running Windows Server 22 on Azure. So you don't need to make utilization of that reboot requirement after every update. So with file servers or Server 2022, if you're using SMB or file shares, SMB now has AES 256-bit encryption, and then there's also the SMB over quick option that comes with the Azure Auto Manage or Server Edition. For my next demo, just going to exit my presentation and take you to my Windows Admin Center. So Windows Admin Center is really just a lightweight web-based HTML way to manage your server infrastructure, both on premises, in Azure, etc. It also has the Windows Admin Center in the Azure portal. So for those of you that are running Windows Server on Azure, in the virtual machine settings blade, you also have the option to use the Windows Admin Center through the Azure portal. So with my Admin Center, I have a couple of machines that I've already connected. They're all running in my Azure environment. I have the one machine that's installed as a gateway, and that basically just means that this is the machine that I'm using my Windows Admin Center. It's installed on my Windows Admin Center, and from that machine, I'm connecting and adding all the servers in my environment. So to add a machine, you could just click on Add, and then select the type of computer or server that you want to add. Click on Add, and then you could just enter in the name and then click on Add, and it will add it in the list. So I've already added a bunch of servers by zooming in or just selecting my management server. It makes a connection to that server, and this is the actual server that I'm working on, signed in on, and then I'm running my Windows Admin Center. So it first will give you an overview of a number of settings and configurations that are set up with your server. And on the left-hand side, you can see all the different management tools. What makes it evident is that immediately you see a lot of Azure options. So that's really where the hybrid environment connection is really strong with Windows Admin Center and Windows Server, especially Windows Server 2022, is that I can immediately configure most of these Azure services for these kind of server environments. Same thing by adding or selecting the Azure Security Center. I can sign into my Azure portal and secure the server directly. I can also do it from within Azure. Going down, you'll see that I get to a lot of the standard features, for example, PowerShell processes the registry of the current machine. I can go to roles and features, and this is where I can install extra specific features. For example, if I want to create a Active Directory domain service or a specific Windows Server role or feature, I can install it onto this box. So I'm just going to collapse and exit that machine. I'm going to select the server. And I'm going to connect using the admin account for the remote server. I'll have to remember what the password was. And I'm just going to select that. And it's basically doing a remote connection from my management gateway server. And now having access to this machine, I can go and install a specific Windows feature. So I'm just going to select Active Directory domain and click on install. And it will basically do exactly the same sort of calculation for dependencies and checking if all the right requirements are being made to install this feature. So all the list of extra roles and features will be installed, and it's doing that installation remotely. So it's gone and ran into a problem. I'm just gonna skip that quickly instead of troubleshooting that. So this is the same thing where if this was a file server, I would be able to create specific volume, for example, by adding extra disks, creating VHD, or maybe even creating a storage pool or a storage migration or specific file share. So this one is connecting. So as you can see, things like the firewall, file, and sharing, etc., can be modified. But I'm just going to skip back to my session, back to the presentation, and I'll troubleshoot that a bit later. So that was just quickly some of the features and ways in which you can manage your Windows Server or servers across your enterprise and configure specific roles, features, and also any other Azure services that you might want to connect or set up. Starting off with different or managing hybrid identities. Now, Active Directory domain services is on Windows Server is the most widely used on-premises identity solution. So with Server 2022, you can migrate or upgrade older domain controllers to Server 2022 domain controllers. So Active Directory domain services, generally you will go and install new domain controllers. We manage our domain through group policy. And if you want to set up your Active Directory domain with a Azure tenant or an Azure Active Directory, you would use Azure AD Connect or set up a hybrid cloud sync to synchronize your on-premises accounts or objects with your Azure Active Directory. So this is just a drawing of Active Directory. You can see in your domain or your Active Directory forest, as we call it, it has a hierarchical structure. So the hierarchy of the forest and the domain, and then different organizational units where you would create your company objects. Now your Active Directory is generally the database of all the networking information of your users, your computers, your group policy objects, and in this hierarchy that you structure within organizational units. Now, generally, Active Directory works with on-premises protocols like LDAP or Kerberos, Kerberos tickets in which security is maintained and guaranteed. But that really just works with your on-premises environment. Generally, you can go and connect through forest trusts, different or separate Active Directory forests. But to connect your on-premises Active Directory, you would just use Azure AD Sync and then connect that to Azure Active Directory. And mostly to install your new domain, or if you want to set up Windows Server as a new domain controller before you want to demote your existing domain controllers, you could use Server Manager. So once you've installed, it's this first management console that opens up where you can then go and select a role or feature to install. So unlike where you can do it through Windows Admin Center, you have the Server Manager option. So you would just select the Active Directory domain services, and then it would go and select all the different items, dependencies and requirements to have that role installed on this server. So once you've gone through and selected the install, it will do a reboot. And then once you restart the machine, you have to do the post-deployment configuration. So the post-deployment is really just where you're promoting the member server to be a domain controller. And once you've added in as a domain controller, you can then specify whether you're setting up a new domain controller in a new domain, in a new forest, or you want to just add an existing into an existing domain with a new fresh server 2022. Maybe you still have some of the 2008, 2012 or 2016 domain controllers that you'd like to migrate off older hardware and into a newer server. So you can do it in this way and then just point to the domain information. And once you've done your installation, you'd be able to just open up your Active Directory users and computers and manage your domain through the different management consoles for domain controllers. So this is where you can go and set up group policy, etc. Now, once you have your existing Active Directory and most of the ways in which we connect our on-premises Active Directory with your Azure Active Directory, which is your identity management in Microsoft Azure, you would do that through Azure AD Connect. It's really just a simple tool that you download from your Azure Active Directory console or view, and then you would install that on a member server, lightweight server, and have enough rights to just read the information within your Azure Active Directory. So it will just take all the user objects and device objects and things like security groups, and it can then provision that in Azure Active Directory. And then once in your Azure Active Directory, you can have access to SaaS applications, cloud apps. If you're running Office 365, you have Azure AD, Azure Active Directory that manages your users and computers that allow access to cloud applications, because cloud applications work on different cloud protocols like OAuth and don't rely on traditional or old legacy protocols like on-premises, such as Kerberos and LDAP. Now, ideally, depending on how you want to set up the synchronization of the provisioning with your Active Directory and also your Azure AD, depends on the different ways in which you can set that up with Azure AD Connect. So one of the ways is just having your Azure AD hybrid identity with the password hash sync. So it will just provision the user objects with the same password hashes, which we also refer to as same sign-in. And one of the nice things or benefits of doing that is one of the security options that Microsoft looks at is sometimes with enterprise customers, if they find specific hashes of passwords on the internet, they can also just let you know. And through things like identity protection with Azure AD, you can protect your on-premises account. So it's always handy to sync with the password hashes. So once the user exists in Azure AD, he can use the same account to access on-premises and also cloud accounts. The next option is Azure AD Hybrid Identity with pass-through authentication. So utilizing a pass-through agent or authentication agent whenever the user signs in, or the Azure AD Connect will do a identity sync, and with the pass-through authentication, the directory query is done with Active Directory through the authentication agent, providing single sign-on. There's also the traditional methods, which is Azure AD Hybrid Identity with federated authentication, which was one of the first methods in which you could provide single sign-on and access to cloud applications and also on-premises with the single or same identity. So where the identity authentication was made directly with Active Directory through the federation servers, and the problem or the issue with ADFS, as we call it, always required multiple infrastructure requirements or roles or servers in the environment to make it work. And quite often you needed dual federation servers, dual federation proxies for security in the perimeter to create that infrastructure setup. Quite often this is not the preferred method anymore. So the preferred method is either using pass-through authentication or password hashing for people that are moving more towards providing cloud services. So some of the next steps in looking at Windows servers and also workloads, and bearing in mind that this presentation also follows up in terms of the requirements based for the Azure AZ-800 certification, which is something that you can also go and download and look at the requirements and exam objectives, and also what's covered in the certification course that's based also on the same number, the AZ-800. So one of the ways in which Windows servers and workloads is managed is by using Azure services. So different Azure services that can manage your Windows servers both in Azure and also on premises. With Azure Arc, and Azure Arc is a control plane for your infrastructure, so you can manage it in the same way as you would your Azure infrastructure. And some of the items that you can go and assign would be the Azure policy for guest configuration. You have the ability to deploy Azure services using virtual machine extensions, and this is also for non-Azure machines. So the way it works is that you would add the Azure Arc agent either through a script onto your on-premises environment so that they are viewed within Microsoft Azure through Azure Arc, and then you can go and deploy all these different services and manage it in a similar way as which you'd manage your Windows servers in Azure and also your Windows servers in across other clouds or on premises. In fact, it doesn't really matter where these servers are running, because Windows Azure Arc can manage them as long as they have access to the Azure portal. So some of the things you can do is manage updates, integrate your Windows servers with Security Center, managing infrastructure as a service VMs, so Azure virtual machines, Windows Server, implement things like automation, and also things like the Azure runbooks, and often with Windows Server, implement some sort of dynamic state configuration to avoid that configuration drift, where the roles and feature sets are installed and also set through a script that gets evaluated from time to time. So that brings me to my next demo. And for my next demo, I'll go to my Azure portal. So I'm just going to exit my presentation. And I am currently signed into my Azure portal. I'm just going to my Azure Arc service. So with Azure Arc, I have already added a machine to my installation. It's a machine that's currently running on my laptop that I'm running on a hypervisor. So it's a Windows server. And one of the machines is running a agent, the Azure Arc agent. So this is the overview. And by clicking all Azure Arc resources in this view, you'll see all the different machines that you have added into your Azure Arc. So I've already added this server. It's a Windows server, and it just creates a identifier or server object that I can view about my machine. So you can see that it's running Windows Server 2022 data center. And I've added these tags. So it's running in the Netherlands in a data center. And some of the operations that I can go and affect on this machine, for example, is do update management, assign Azure policy, view things like change tracking, enable monitoring. So I can manage this machine pretty much like my Azure resources. Also so you can see it's a virtual machine. I can add extensions or view extensions. And I'm just going to go back to Azure Arc. So ideally, depending on the type of infrastructure that I want to add into my Azure Arc environment, I have Azure Arc virtual machines, which is in preview, and then Azure Stack HCI if I'm running Windows Server HCI devices in my environment. Any Kubernetes clusters, SQL servers, and even VMware vCenters can be added so I can view some of those virtual machines running in VMware. For data services, I can have Postgres and also SQL managed instances, but through servers, I can go and click on add. And if I want to add a single server, multiple servers, I can also add service from my update management or through Azure Migrate. So if I do discover machines through the VMware vSphere environment and I want to migrate them to my Azure environment, I can immediately add them into Azure Arc through the Azure Migrate process discovery and assessment tool. So generally adding a single server, you will just click on generate script. So that's basically just a script that you need to go and connect or run onto that local Windows Server machine. So it will say that port 443 needs to be open and also certain outbound URLs so that Azure Arc agent can communicate to the Azure Arc service and connect to the on-premises machine, and then also local administrator permissions, the connectivity scope, and also to manage, it will be added into an existing resource group. So going next, you will then specify the resource group, the region, etc., and also the connectivity method. So whether it's using a public endpoint, so can access internet, or through a proxy server or a private endpoint, which is through an virtual network in Azure or ExpressRoute or VPN, that sort of thing. So once you click, let me just select a resource group and click next. So this is where you can add all the tags for data center, city, state, region, etc. But I just want to quickly show you that it will produce the script that will immediately download the Azure Arc agent for Windows, install it, and then it will do a check to make sure that it's installed correctly. And once it's installed, it will try and connect to the Azure Arc service by connecting through running the agent, connecting to the resource group, my tenant information, the subscription, and then it will give me the option to sign in using my Azure credentials with a secure code to ensure that I enable that into my Azure Arc environment. So once you've done that sign in, the agent setup, and everything is set up, and then it generally takes a while for the server to show as connected. So it's currently connected and managed through my Azure Arc. So some of the options, for example, update management, I can go and manage this through my Azure management, and I can enable, if I've enabled the other dependencies, for example. So a lot of the things that I can go and do for automation, etc., or things like inventory management as well. So basically, just things like extensions that you can add. For example, my log analytics agent that I might want to have installed onto the machine. I specify the workspace ID and also my workspace key, and then I can go and configure and push that out. Same thing with some of the other running a custom script, for example, and utilizing some sort of automation. So really handy having that single control plane to manage not just your Azure environment, but also all these different kinds of infrastructure, virtual machines running in Azure, uh, Azure Stack, on-premises, or in other on-premises VMware, vCenters, or cloud environments. So some of the new features that are in preview is more like the Azure features that's still in the previous selection. For example, assigning and running logic apps and app services and those items. So for just showing you that if you go to your virtual machines where you have a virtual machine blade where you can add extensions into your VM. So you're basically getting the same functionality for your virtual machines, no matter where they run or exist on your environment. So quite often with most hybrid environments, you'll be spending a lot of time in your Azure portal or through command line, etc., where you'd be managing and implementing the deployments of virtual machines and also specific roles and features, and installing those workloads onto your machines. So that was a quick view on using Azure Arc to manage your Windows servers using Azure services. So you can add Azure services and manage all your machines through those. So with Windows Server, you have the option to run Hyper-V, to install the Hyper-V role on your physical server or on a virtual machine to do nested virtualization. And then you can run virtual machines on a single host, depending on the specs of the CPU, RAM, and hard disk, etc. Something that's also available now, and actually due to the fact that most of the trend of companies and also for developers is to create applications using containers. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Azure Kubernetes, or just Kubernetes in general, the clustering and orchestration of containers is really the hot trend at the moment for people all over the world in which they just host their applications. So with Server 2022, Microsoft has made images of Windows Server available as a container, which will allow you to host your application on a Windows Server container. So through Docker, etc., you can do a pull and pull it locally to install the image, and then modify the image, upload that into your registry or into your Docker Hub or other repository, and then to your deployment of your application. So with Windows Server, a lot of new options, and also some of the same features and functionality that you're already used to running virtual machines on Hyper-V through Windows Server containers, Linux containers, also on Kubernetes clusters, along with integration if using Azure Kubernetes clusters into native Azure services. And just like you've seen in the previous demo where I've shown you the Azure Arc, for management of Azure Arc, you have the option for Kubernetes clusters as well, because that's just another virtualized environment, and where you can go and manage the cubes, containers, etc. I'm just going to skip this demo quickly to show you the base images. So this is the number of images that you can go and get with Windows Server 2022. You have Windows Server Core, which supports traditional .NET and framework applications. So you have pretty much the smaller image that contains a subset of the server APIs, but the full .NET framework, so you can host those applications on there. And sometimes most, but not all, of these server roles, for example, things like fax server, you want get on that specific container image. There's still the Nano server image, so that's specifically built for .NET Core applications. It's the smallest image that you can get, and it's also the only place where Nano server is still pretty much supported. And then you have the Windows container, which is the full set of Windows API system services minus server roles. And then there's the Windows full server with Windows API set. And it's really just basically going to the Microsoft image repo and doing a Docker pull from that location. So with on-premises and hybrid network infrastructure, the idea is basically that you're always running either an on-premises environment and you have an Azure environment and you want to connect the two networks with one another. There are different ways in which you can do that depending on your needs, requirements, and also the workloads. Sometimes it's fine just to have a environment set up where the you're hosting an application in Azure, but one of the requirements, and also in the AZ-800 course and also for the certification, is to understand how you would work with a network infrastructure in Azure, for example, setting up your virtual networks, having your different subnets configured, and also your VNet gateway, things like VNet peering, and then also how you would connect that to your on-premises environments, either through a VPN site-to-site connection or an express route connection, which is a physical connection that you have through a telecoms provider. If you want to set up a point-to-site environment from a Windows server to a Azure Virtual Network or VNet Gateway, you can do that with the network adapter option in Windows Server. You can manage it through your Windows Admin Center to set that up in your Windows Server management tool. And that will allow you to have a point-to-site VPN connection that you'd be able to share basically with the rest of your on-premises machines. Normal things like DNS, for example, having your on-premises DNS forwarded to your Azure DNS if you set it up, and also still being able to set up DHCP with Windows Server 2022, or how you would be utilizing the built-in DHCP functionality in your virtual networks on Azure for the subnets that you would configure. In fact, the demo for this I would just have shown you in the Azure portal. You have your virtual networks, so you'd be able to set up a virtual network in Azure just by adding the create a resource and selecting network, and then just following the wizard, or you could use PowerShell or an ARM template, and then just give it a name. Specify your region. Next, select the IP address space inside a notation depending on the number of IP addresses. I'm just going to leave it as blank, and then you can immediately add different subnets or divide your entire virtual network into different subnets. Things like security, you can enable connecting firewalls or a bastion host in which you can specify as jump host. I'm just going to finish it quickly to show you how quickly you can go and create a virtual network. So this is something that happens really fast, as you can see, because it's software defined networking. So in the backend, there's just we defining our network, and Azure really handles everything in the backend. So over here with address space, I can go and add or adjust that. In subnets, I can add multiple subnets, add a gateway subnet, for example, and specify the gateway subnet address space depending on what I need. And then I can just click on save, and I will have a gateway subnet. So when I set up a VPN gateway, I can utilize a gateway subnet. And one of the things that we can also do with the virtual networks in Azure is setting up tiering. So yeah, you can tier or connect it to other remote virtual networks, etc. So quite a lot of options that you can go and utilize. I'm not going to really go through with the entire wizard, but just to quickly show you to create a VNet virtual network gateway is just specifying the subscription, the region, resource group, and then the VPN or gateway type. So if you're going to set up an express route or a VPN, and then the type of connection, if you're doing route-based connections or policy-based. So the SKU just really depends on the number of circuits and connections that you want to allow within, and then specifically the generations, and then the extra information such as the public IP address and also where the different which was that, this one, and then selecting the network. That was there. Yeah, well, but that's basically some of the things, and then connected to the VNet gateway. So I'm just going to exit that. Locally, we looked at the let's go to this one. So on the Windows Admin Center, you have the networks option where you can add a network adapter, where you can set up a point-to-site VPN connection to an Azure virtual network gateway. So this is really just a really easy, simple way in which to connect to that virtual network gateway in Azure. Let me just go back to my session. So just a quick round trip through virtual networks, creating what you would need to do to create a VNet gateway or an express route gateway to connect to your virtual network or network on-premise, and then the network adapter, which you can set up on Windows Server 2022 through Windows Admin Center to have that point-to-site connection. Or once you've set up your VNet gateway, you would just follow the instructions to create a configuration for your on-premises network device. So one of the, or lastly, the remaining services or modules that generally gets covered with Windows Server in a hybrid environment is the storage and file services. So with storage and file services, we look at things like creating an Azure file sync server endpoint on your on-premises Windows Server. So the Azure file sync service is a service that you create in Azure that allows you to sync or synchronize file server shares to Azure storage account file shares. So you can set up a sync group or install an agent on your different file servers, selecting specific shares which you want to sync to Azure. And then with Windows Server 2022, you can create traditional Windows Server file shares where you can use the file server resource manager to create file shares and also specify any quotas for different shares that you want to share in your environment. There's also a way in which you can use server storage spaces, so where you can go and connect multiple disks into specific volume sizes, and you can just increase the available storage space for your file servers by creating different storage pool made of all of these different disks and create larger volumes. Storage migration service is great if you need to migrate file share or data to Azure data stores. And then same thing with Windows Server, you have storage replica where you can create replicas or synchronizations from different storage on-premises to other on-premises servers. On-premises is sometimes if you have, hardware that's running out of space, or you need to add extra disks. Sometimes it takes a while to get those disks with data duplication. you can actually compromise or ensure that you have extra space by compacting the existing data by utilizing data deduplication. So it's just one of those servers that's still available within Server 2022. Then obviously the different file systems that's available. So from NTFS and refs. With the Azure file sync, the ability to create hybrid file servers. So by setting up your on-premises file servers with the file sync agent, so just to give you a view of the different options instead of creating this demo, is just to show you that you can have your Azure file shares in your environment, and you can synchronize all your different file shares across your different organizations or branch offices, all to centrally placed Azure file shares that clients can access. So it's quite a convenient way, especially if you need to have remote data locations where accessing the Azure file share is a lot quicker through internet. So that's basically what I would have shown you in the demo, but that's why I added the screenshot. Just to quickly recap. So there's better security with Windows Server 2022. With managing identities, you have the option to create on-premises Active Directory. You have the option to still utilize Azure AD Connect and have hybrid environment setups with Azure Active Directory to provision user objects and also device objects and groups, etc. with Azure, and then managing the environment for single sign-on. There's multiple methods in which you can manage Windows servers and workloads through tooling like Windows Admin Center, Server Manager, PowerShell, and also Azure Arc, for not just Azure workloads, but also on-premises workloads and also cross clouds, all virtual machines that are running. The capabilities of creating Hyper-V virtual machines, and also Windows Server 2022 container images that you can utilize within your Docker environment or your Kubernetes environments. And then there's myriad ways in which you can go and either manage and connect your on-premises networks with your network infrastructure, virtual networks in Azure and other clouds, and whereby you can use VPNs, and also the express route option. With storage and file services, you can go and set up file shares, file syncs with Azure File Sync, and also utilizing things like storage pools, data deduplication, and specifying quotas on all your on-premises file servers. For the rest, all the information that you would need would be on the docs.microsoft.com. So I'm just going to jump to the Microsoft.com, and that's basically your one-stop shop for everything Microsoft. You have Azure, you have Windows, and you can drill down to Windows Server, documentation, connecting Azure to a hybrid service where you can read up how to utilize Windows Admin Center. With Learn, there's modules that you can go and follow, create your own learning path. You also have the certifications that you can go and view and look up, for example, the AZ-800, and by evaluating what is required for the exam, you only need 700 points to pass. And then you have the skills measured. So this is where you can immediately see what kind of content is matched to the exam. So this is the skills that you'd require. And the nice thing about this is seeing the weight of the different modules as to how heavy they'd be on the exam for this certification. So you can see that deploying and managing Active Directory domain services in on-premises and cloud environments is quite the largest portion of the exam. And the nice thing is not much has changed with the way you would use Server 2022 versus 2019 to create the same thing. It's just that the focus is on setting up the hybrid connectivity with Azure Active Directory for this exam objective. So configuring and managing multi-site, multi-domain. So if you have some sort of Windows Server Active Directory experience, this should really carry you quite far. What is new is creating maybe security principles, implementing group managed service accounts, joining service to the domain, Azure AD, and also Azure ADDS, and then implementing Azure AD Connect, as I've mentioned. So group policy, once again, ends it off, and then you have the different ways in which you can go and manage Windows servers. And this is 10 to 15%, so you won't be getting too much of those. Virtual machines and containers, implementing and managing on-premises hybrid infrastructure. And then the next step is final storage and file services, setting up Azure File Sync, server file shares, and server storage. So a lot of the requirements for this exam is basically existing knowledge that and experience that most candidates already have. So just jumping back to my presentation. So Microsoft Learn, docsmicrosoft.com, and the next steps for everybody would be to try and download the evaluation, Windows Server 2022. I know that a few months ago, the evaluation center had some issues, but it's up and running. I've been told by Microsoft you can go and try the eval versions of Windows Server, deployed in Azure, deployed on a virtual machine, and really try out the management of Admin Center, Azure Arc, etc. You also have the different marketplace items and have a look at the different volume licensing service center to read up on the new core licensing requirements. With that, I'm jumping to the Teams to see if there's any questions or
Dag
chat.
Er is één vraag binnengekomen van Wim.
Ja.
De vraag luidt: in 2018 is ons bedrijf overgestapt van Windows Server 2008 naar 2016. Toen hadden we een weekend nodig om over te stappen. Najaar 2023 overwegen we om over te stappen naar Windows Server 2022. Hebben we dan weer een migratieweekend nodig of kunnen we de servers om de beurt upgraden?
Het hangt af van de servers. So je zou om de beurt kunnen upgraden, afhankelijk van de workload. Uit mijn eigen persoonlijke ervaring met migraties en implementaties over al die jaren, en dan praat ik over sinds 95. Soms hangt het gewoon af van de type workloads en ook wie het doet. Dus afhankelijk van dingen zoals de Active Directory domains overzetten misschien. Ja, dat kan er gewoon tijdens werkuren gebeuren. afhankelijk van de domeincontrole die overgezet worden, etc. Dus in principe is daar minimal downtime vereist. Alleen waar je dan wel wat downtime hebt, is als de workload afhankelijk is en zeg maar een continue uptime moeten hebben en beschikbaarheid. Ja, dat gaat niet lukken tijdens een installatie of even een migratie. Dus afhankelijk van de grootte van de organisatie en ook de type workload, zou jij wel misschien de lastige applicaties en systemen voor een weekend nodig hebben. Wat ik wel weet is dat soms vinden ICT'ers gewoon leuk om weekends te werken. Al de pizza's en ook de rustige werksfeer. Maar ja, dat is mijn antwoord, Wim.
Super, Adnan. Dat waren de vragen.
Oké, met dat was het eind van mijn sessie. Dank je en thank you.
Hartstikke bedankt, Adnan.